Nebraska football gets its first win in its last, 8 tries, I believe, going back to 2021. So, what better time than to bring back an old friend, a man that has moved on to bigger and better things, a man that is about to cover an NFL season that'll begin next weekend. So, we had to get him pretty much this week, or we weren't going to be able to talk to him again until January. And that would be Parker Gabriel, formerly of the Lincoln Journal-Star, currently covering the Denver Broncos for USA Today. Parker, welcome back to college football.
Feels good to be talking about Nebraska at 6 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday.
You're a pretty good friend when you get the 6 a.m. duty, and I'm not really giving you a lot of choice in the whole matter. And you get to talk about the North Dakota Fighting Hawks.
Hey, just bring me in. Just bring me in. When you need the big guns, right after the North Dakota game.
I mean, look, if you don't need the big guns after a 7-7 start against North Dakota, that I know it's tied, but somehow felt even closer than a tie could at that time, if that makes any sense. I want to start with this because you obviously you covered the team up through. You saw the entire spring. You left in May.
Yeah,
is that about right?
Ball, basically. Yeah.
It hasn't been that long, but there's been 2 games, and I know you watched both of them. But what's the out of the bubble view of Nebraska look for you at the moment? Because you're not around it day to day. You're not covering it day to day. You're not talking to the key people like you were, and so it allows, I would imagine, and a future part of me wishes for fresh eyes, to be able to put on the situation. What does it look like outside of the media bubble of covering this team now that you've been able to do it for the last 2 weeks?
Yeah, it's sort of interesting because I know everybody on the team, not personally necessarily, but like I am pretty familiar with the depth chart, I guess you would say. And I obviously know a lot of the players and most of the coaches, and I follow everybody still that covers the team. So I don't know if it's fully an outsider view yet. It probably will be more in a year or something like that. But it's interesting because I thought the Ireland game just went exactly like I thought it would. I didn't know if they were going to win or lose, but you just knew with Northwestern that it was going to be close, that it wasn't going to be a blowout the way it was last year. And inevitably, I just kept telling people when people hear or just from around or from home or from Nebraska or whatever, whenever anybody asked what I thought was going to happen in that game, it's like, well, for the most part, these games come down to who's better coached with Nebraska and Northwestern. They're always close. And so it didn't shock me that one went the way it did. The manner that it went, obviously, is always has been the sort of interesting thing with Nebraska, especially over the past 5 years as I've been around it. I think that I've been surprised. I think like a lot of people have been, that they've struggled to the extent that they have on defense. I think that it was really easy to undersell or underappreciate what Markel Dismuke and Deontay Williams meant to the defense. Other guys too, obviously. Cam Taylor-Britt's a really good player. But those 2 guys, I think in particular, you can just see it. They got so that you just never saw them bust communication wise. They were so solid. They did a lot of stuff that, even though they were both like big hitters and flashy players a little bit in their own right, they did so much stuff that wasn't flashy that I think it was easy to maybe overlook a little bit how difficult they were going to be to replace. And, I think up front, I think offensively, it's just a big work in progress sort of across the board. It hasn't looked great all the time up front, but it also, they're just searching for a lot of stuff. And so I think they have potential there. And it's possible that they're going to be pretty good offensively by the end of the year. But I think, as we've been saying since November, basically, that a lot of things have to go right for that to be the case. Sorry if that was a long ramble.
No, not nothing to be sorry about. It actually hit on one of the questions I had prepared. I didn't prepare a ton of them, but I did have a couple. And to be honest, part of it to me is you watch last year's team and some of the pieces have changed. Some are very similar. Schematically, a lot looks different. But I am kind of curious, and I guess this is sort of, your classic leading question. So I'll change it up a little bit. Are you surprised at all by the tackling issues Nebraska has had since, there's a fair amount, and especially when you're talking the middle of that defense with the linebackers, it's not like there's a lot of new guys. I mean, I know Nick Henrich didn't play this Saturday, but he did against Northwestern. It just, to me, the lack of just being able to wrap up and bring guys down. I mean, I know they weren't perfect last year, but it felt like they were fundamentally a lot more solid than where they are at this point right now.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that some of that, again, like some of that has to do with the guys who are doing the tackling last year. I mean, again, I think you're getting an appreciation for just how good of a year JoJo Doman had last year and what his ability was to sort of clean some stuff up. Certainly, I think Nick Henrich and in week one and Luke Reimer and that whole inside group would tell you probably that they need to tackle better and Giffer and Kolarovic too in that group, and then the safeties again. And to me, like the thing is, everybody in that defense is relatively familiar with. Well, most of the guys are. I mean, obviously Ernest Hausman's playing now, and he's a new guy, and up front they have a lot of moving pieces. I think they got to a point where they were really steady last year. All the defensive linemen, everybody knew what they were doing all the time, and so that helps. If you're Luke Reimer, it helps to know where an offensive lineman is going to be climbing from and who it is that's responsible for making sure that doesn't happen and all of that. And I've seen enough of Eric Chenander teams to think that that's probably going to get better as Nash Hutmacher's played more football and as Wynn and the kid from Texas Tech, as they sort of like get into fully integrated and all of that. Like, competition's only going to get tougher, obviously. But, we'll sort of see how that goes. I think it's just there's a little bit more changeover maybe than I considered on that side of the ball too. And certainly you've just got some young players who are figuring it out for the first time. I mean, you can tell that Marcus Buford's going to be a good player. And you can also tell he's a young guy who's playing a lot for the first time. So all that kind of like fits together. And it's interesting, Schaefer, because this feels to me like a team that has some upward mobility and that can get better as the year goes on. But the nature of the situation, just obviously with Frost, jobs on the line and there's a lot of new coaches and all that. And it just seems like there's sort of a question about the extent to which everybody's going to feel like they actually have time to get better and to develop and to be a team that's a lot better in November than it was in late August. So it's fascinating to see if there's enough wiggle room to not press, to allow yourself to get better, to then not feel like, oh, crap, we have to win no matter what it looks like. And that's the name of the game, obviously, but I just think it's sort of an interesting spot they're in at this point.
Yeah. So we're just going to jump around here because I didn't plan to get into this early, but your answer sort of led to one of the things I want to talk to you about, because I think a challenge that I am having, and I think maybe other media people are having, and certainly maybe the fan base too, though I don't know if they think about it in the same perspective as this. When you look at this Nebraska team, and I know you don't cover it on a day-to-day basis anymore, but do you look at it as it's year 5 for Scott Frost, or do you look at it as it's supposed to be year 1 in the current operation? Because they're dramatically different, even though they're the same thing. Like, yes, Scott Frost has been the head coach for 5 years, but they did undergo seismic changes in the offseason. And yet at the same time, do you extend a fair amount of grace to an operation that has sort of proven that whatever they've changed, fundamentally, they still come up short in a lot of areas? Like, it's just it's an existential question that I don't know that you're going to be able to answer. And I sit there during every single
Right.
snap of this season thinking, well, if this was year one or maybe even year two, I would be regarding what's going on a lot different. But it's year 5 for the head coach, but it's year 1 for the defensive scheme.
Right.
It's year 1 for the quarterback and the offensive coordinator. Like I what do I do, Parker? Help me out.
I know. That's a tough one. And that's, when Scott fired those 4 guys last November, like we put this question to Trev Alberts directly the first time we talked to him of like, does this reset the clock, or is this it has to work right away? And he said it has to work right away. And so I think of it more as a year 5.
Okay.
And I think that, Trev's comments about, well, he sort of made no bones about the fact that this doesn't normally work. And like, it's I don't know that he said it's a long shot, but that's essentially what it boils down to, right? Is like, it's a long shot to be able to rework your entire offensive philosophy and change Scott's role in the whole thing and expect that just is, you're just going to roll it off the assembly line and it's going to be fine. So I think I think of it as a year 5, basically. I mean, I think of it as essentially like, you got to pull the rabbit out of the hat. And I think of it largely, and I don't know, and I don't poke around as much as I used to, obviously.
Smart man.
I just think of it. I've watched every minute that I've watched so far, which is most of them, and read everything that I've read under the impression, essentially, that Scott's like good and well behind the 8 ball. And that's just sort of like how my brain processes it, I guess. And what's going to be super interesting is if it looks better 6 weeks from now than it looks right now, because the hardest call to make is going to be like, it's going like this. Is it going that way fast enough? That would be like, I think that's like probably the most difficult decision to make for the powers that be. So, I mean, and that the power that be, I guess, Trev. So yeah, it's, I think of it as a year 5, and I think of it as they got to have a whole lot of things go right, and they have to demonstrate quite a bit in a short period of time. I guess that's what it is. Like, Scott, more than anybody, has to demonstrate a lot in a very short period of time. And I don't think necessarily that so far that's happened. Doesn't mean it can't, though. And that's what makes the season sort of so fascinating.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's hold off on a couple more big picture things and we'll circle back to those. And let's just dive into some of the pieces and we'll start on the offensive side of the ball. And how they've sort of looked to you, and if it matches up with what you thought these guys could be based on your time covering this spring. A lot of new pieces on the offensive side, and we'll start right at that quarterback spot. Not in a very different way, but not a dramatically different overall box score than what Adrian Martinez would look like through 2 weeks, doing it more with his arm than his legs. But what have you made of the Casey Thompson experience through 2 games so far?
Yeah, obviously, in like the first drives have been very impressive in both games. And you can see the talent. I mean, you can see the talent. You can see the ball placement. And again, I think you have to I don't know exactly how we'll get better at this. The more and more the transfer thing just becomes the way of the world. But it's hard for me a little bit to put the performance into the context of what's actually happening. That didn't Marcus Washington just get to campus in July maybe? Yeah. And you're figuring it out, and he had to win, and Casey had to win the job. I think he probably was going to, just based on the experience, if nothing else, and all that. I think he's pretty good. And I also think this has been the way it's been since I've paid any attention to Nebraska football whatsoever, essentially. There's just not a lot of room for error, and that makes life difficult as a quarterback. When he threw that pick over the middle against North Dakota, I was like, oh man, it didn't feel like it was going to cost them the game, but it put North Dakota in position to tie it in the second half. And so you're like, well, you can't make that mistake. Well, I mean, that's a lot to ask of a college kid anytime you're saying like no mistakes. And they want him to be aggressive and push the ball down the field. And you've seen him do a lot of that. I thought you felt the weight of the pressure a little bit against Northwestern. It just, there was a lot riding on that, and it got a little squirrely in the second half and all that. And I think you've seen the good stuff, and you've seen, like a lot of college players, some of the accuracy issues crop up at some times, but certainly he looks like a more refined passer. I think I was just looking right now, he's 59.5% completion, so room to improve there, obviously. But yeah, he's played pretty well, all things considered. Not perfect, but for what they're dealing with and all the change and all that, like I think he's been exciting to watch. Obviously, he's got a lot of playmaking ability.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, do you sense when you've watched the wide receivers so far, do you feel like there's more upside than there was in 2021 or 2020? Or is it a situation where Samori Toure is clearly a better number one, but maybe they have a little bit more depth overall? I mean, what do you think of the wide receiver room, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to put it, Schaefer. I mean, Toure really, I mean, you get in a sense of how talented he was just in the sheer fact that he made the Packers initial 53 and all that. But yeah, I think they have more depth. You've been on the Isaiah Garcia Castaneda train from the start. Congratulations. He's looked.
I don't know. It could be an Oliver Martin situation all over again. Lead the team in week 1 and then disappear until week 7.
Yeah, that it could be. He looks like he can.
I don't think it's going to
be.
But.
Neither do I. And and they've got some they just have a collection of. They have more length and more speed, I think, than they've had in the past. When you're talking about Garcia Castaneda and Palmer and Manning and Washington, then you've got Alante Brown, and I mean they've got some guys that can play, and then. Sort of like think about Vokalek being part of that collection too when he's healthy, and so yeah, I mean, I think they have more depth. Not sure, we'll see. Like again, it's one of the things about this team is like everybody is in a new role basically. Like I think Trey Palmer, we'll see. Maybe he'll look like a game breaker by the end of the year. Maybe he won't, but we're sort of like learning that as we go. I'm not sure they have a guy who's ready-made like Toure was last year. He obviously went from playing mostly outside to playing more in the slot at Nebraska, and that role suited him really well. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. I keep saying that, but that sort of seems like the nature of this season. Yep. I think they've got more talent outside. You can tell the effect that Mickey Joseph has had on that room. And then the question, I think, over the next several weeks is like, how much is it that they're just asked to go make plays and be a good group? Or is it like the whole thing is on them? And based on what we saw, what we've seen from Anthony Grant, which is probably where we're going, I think there's hope that they've got a real guy at running back too.
Yeah, well, let's just go straight to that. Anthony Grant, monster game against North Dakota, had 101 yards against Northwestern. In both games, showed off the sort of home run threat that, I mean, you covered Nebraska. Congratulations, Parker. You covered Nebraska from 2017 through 2021. Maybe the roughest era of running backs, at least in my short 34 years on this planet. And Anthony Grant looks to be unique. I don't want to put him in categories of some of the best that I've seen from Nebraska, but in a short time, he shows the kind of elusiveness and open field running that really only Maurice Washington has had over the last few years. So it's a unique deal, but Anthony Grant, and it's not just those 46-yard runs. I mean, honestly, the ones that blew me away, both against Northwestern and against North Dakota. Like, he would have these like 5 or 6 yards where he'd have to make 5 people miss because, quite frankly, and we're going to get to him, the guys up front haven't exactly deterred anyone from coming through that offensive line.
Yeah. I thought, wasn't it? It was like one of the first carries against Northwestern, wasn't it? 3rd and 1, and he
had to fight through 3 guys to get it.
Yeah, and he got it. And like, that's the one, that's as much as anything. And I think you saw later, it's not to pick on Yant. I mean, later on the goal line, they had a 3 or 4 plays where they didn't get it in a row. And that's the kind of guy, like, I think over the course of the season, number 10 is going to get those carries. And you can see why. I mean, he's powerful. He's shifty. He can make somebody miss. I like him. I mean, I think he's looked really good so far. And I'm not sure he's an All-American or anything like that. But the thing that's been said over the last 5 years a lot is, like, if they just had a guy who was like, above average Big Ten back. And if you're an above average Big Ten back, you're really good. And I think that's what he looks like. I mean, and yesterday, I think AJ Allen looks really promising. Not surprising given what he did in high school, but you still have to come in and do it at the college level. And he's really young, and he's, got a long way to go and all that. And they need to let Rahmir out of the cage at some point and all of that. But, they've got some pieces to work with there. And Grant has seems like he's clearly separated himself so far, which is funny because since you're a recruiting guy, we can go down this rabbit hole a little bit. But remember, he just showed up that visit weekend as Brian Applewhite got hired. He wasn't really a Brian Applewhite guy. He just happened to be coming to campus on one of those big visit weekends in January when Applewhite's first day on the job. He got there and he watched him and he was like, "Oh, sure, let's take him. This guy's good." And it looks like it's going to work out pretty well for Nebraska.
My favorite Anthony Grant factoid that I probably don't repeat enough, and I know that because we've marveled over this same thing. The 3 teams in early to mid-January that he was essentially going to choose from and then immediately enroll included Nebraska, where he went, and then Florida Atlantic, okay, opportunities, sure, and then USC.
Right.
Like,
I wonder if anybody's ever had those 3 hats on the table.
Yeah, I don't know. 3 of just wildly different scenarios all the way around. You have a Sun Belt team that if he went there and then wins that job, I think he would put up a monster, amount of yards. I don't know how good FAU is, but just guessing against Sun Belt defenses and what they have and what they don't have, he's running for a lot. He goes to USC. I don't know how that works either, but Lincoln Riley has such a history of using playmakers. I'm sure he would have found some way to get involved. Instead, he ends up in Nebraska, becomes a starting running back, supplants Rahmir Johnson, and that leads me to this. Over the last few years, one of the issues I think that has popped up, and you didn't know if it was a staff thing or if it was a Scott Frost thing, and it feels like it may be entering that territory. They really seem to struggle to identify which personnel they want to play. And then especially on the offensive side of the ball, have a habit of telling you how they're going to get so-and-so into a game and then really don't do it. Rahmir Johnson feels like the latest example of this. Previously, you had Xavier Betts and a handful of other guys. Is it a possibility that it's just hard on game day to figure out how to work these people in? Or there was just no scenario where Rahmir Johnson can get some run, even as a slot wide receiver? Or was he maybe not as good as we thought he was last year when he kind of carried Nebraska in a lot of situations?
Yeah, the thing is, so first of all, until last year, this is not to put this all on Rahmir, until last year, the thing with Rahmir was always that he's a great kid. He wants to do it and all of that. And he'd struggled with consistency and sort of he overcame that, as kids often do as they develop, in college in a program, to get to the point where he really earned the staff's trust. I don't obviously really know what the deal is this year, why he hasn't played. It seems like there should be a way to use him. And the thing to me is like, I always think that the mark of one of the many marks of good, coaches is when they figure out guys' roles and then they maximize players in those roles. It seems to me, being completely away from it and not at all a football coach, that he's good enough and that Nebraska's talent is not so overwhelming that there should be a role for him. But I also like part of this then comes back to the identity thing. Like it's easier, I'm trying to think of a good example. Like it's easier for somebody who has a true offensive identity and like a culture put together offensively to hey, we like guys like this and we use them like this. Like how can Nebraska say that when they have they can't even say who's calling the plays in the second half, like and so because they're trying to like figure all this stuff out and they're trying to like create this thing from scratch. Like this isn't a great recruiting pitch, but like you're not exactly asking, you're not exactly like maximizing the opportunity that brain trust collectively as smart and as much as they know about offensive football. Like that's not a great recipe for being able to identify, hey, since we love doing this so much, we can use Ramir like this. Like they're still in the like, what do we love doing phase rather than we've got this spot for this guy. So, it seems like he's sort of stuck in that a little bit maybe. And I don't know, maybe he just hasn't earned it. Seems like over the past few years, he's really put himself in position to play. But yeah, it's my gut would be to chalk that up to they're still trying to figure things out offensively, and it's week 2 now, and who knows where it'll go from here.
I mean, I wish we had more time because there's a lot of different ways.
I know. Yeah, we could do this for 3 hours. Probably.
I know. And people want it. I get told the podcasts are too short, but I like to keep the people wanting. I want to throw this at you because you touched on things that I've thought about, that I've wanted to write about, that I haven't quite been able to corral and put into my brain and then send through my brain to my fingers and get onto a screen. But you're talking about yeah. You were talking about the lack of identity, and I think this all kind of goes together. Their procuring of talent, the way they've assembled these skill position players, it has always kind of felt to me, and some of this is just sort of the hubris of Scott Frost, that he could take whatever the system was that he built and just plug and play different guys of different skill sets, and it would be fine because the system was so strong it could handle everything. Because you go look at how they recruit running backs. Anthony Grant is nothing like A.J. Allen, who A.J. Allen yesterday, when I asked him if he and Anthony Grant talk on the sidelines about what they're seeing from the North Dakota defense, he kind of like looked at me and goes, well, we're different running backs.
Yeah.
And in my head, I'm like, yeah, I mean, that's true. Like, you don't have the same style and all of that. But yeah, so you have those guys. They're nothing like Jock Ant. They're nothing like Ramir Johnson. You text me during the game, like, this would look different if that was DeAndre Jackson.
Yeah.
I just think a lot of their skill position procuring of talent, and one of the reasons that they've been so underwhelming at running back and wide receiver for 5 years, up until, right now, if Anthony Grant and hitting on a few individuals, there's no basis for what they're doing. Right. They're just grabbing players and just thinking it's going to fit. Wisconsin has certain types of running backs that they want. Minnesota has certain wide receivers that they want to fill those Tyler Johnson, Rashad Bateman roles. There's a reason Jalen Berger isn't still at Wisconsin. He's probably going to be fine at Michigan State. But
he ran for 100+ yesterday, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just I almost think that it's part of why they're where they are in year 5 is that they bet so heavily on the system and didn't bet heavily enough on evaluating the types of players that go into the system. Am I like off my rocker with that thought process?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there's been it's been very interesting to watch this kind of like attempt for it to come together over the course of Frost being at Nebraska, right? I mean, at the beginning, it was truly like system reliant. That was the system was going to be what won them games, and then it became clear that they needed to be bigger and more physical. But they sort of like swung really hard in that direction. And so, like, I think one of the things that you can sense a little bit this year is that, like, all of the new guys on offense, they think about personnel different than the coaches before did. And it's not rocket science or breaking news, but like Donovan Raiola seems to like a different style of offensive lineman than just like, let's take the biggest guys we can find and then get them as strong as we can get them mantra. And, Brian Applewhite, they took Anthony Grant and they had all these running backs, and then he got there and they wanted AJ Allen too. And Mickey Joseph, he brought in Palmer and they went through the spring, and then and Garcia Castaneda, and they went through the spring, and then he was like, I need another one. So he went and took Marcus Washington, and like all across the board is sort of this like, Whipple, same thing, they were in on Casey Thompson and then Purdy too, so it's like all of these, it's like this, they're trying to, it was going to be a period of transition, and then they're also like transitioning and doing it without the benefit of having like recruited to whatever it is they're trying to do or want to do for a couple of years. And so it's sort of a mismatch, and that's how it was going to be this year as soon as they went this way. And Scott said, knew he had to win this year, and said, we're going to recruit difference makers and try to plug gaps out of the portal and all that. Like, this was always the way it was going to be, but you're seeing the difficulty of it like play out in real time. And then not only that, but like they've had this thing where they've tried to shift on the fly pretty much every year. They've had to because of personnel. Whether it's misidentifying somebody or wanting somebody for a role that then you can't really, like Wan'Dale Robinson is the example I think of. Like, I was wondering yesterday when they came out and started running all this, read option stuff in the second half, like if they were Wan'Dale Robinson-ing Casey Thompson, like they told him, this is your role. You're going to do this. We're going to highlight you in this way. And the bullets start flying, and you've got to try to win a game. Are they going to do this with them, and say, hey, look, man, the way that we actually can win games this year is for you to be in the zone read and run the ball quite a bit, And with Wan'Dale, it was, you can be a receiver. And then they ran out of running backs, and they needed a running back. They put him back there again, and that made him mad. And they changed the role from what they said one thing, and then they did another thing. That's life in sports to some degree. Like, you got to try to win games, and you want your best players to be where you need them to win games. But I mean, this is going to keep like moving. The target's going to keep moving, I think, not in expectations, but just like in literally what they do, especially offensively. And I don't think it's impossible that they find the thing that works, and then they run off a little ways on offense. But it better happen quickly. And that's sort of been the challenge and what makes this all sort of, in Trev Albert's words, not that commonly successful.
I have like 15 other things that I want to ask you, but I also have other obligations, and I promise you it'd be around 30 minutes, and I don't want to use up all of the grace that I have with you.
I've got nowhere to be, so you just tell me when you got to go.
All right. Let's get one more thing in here, because you kind of mentioned it. It's been a topic of conversation on the message board. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up. We'll make this sort of the last topic. Does it matter, or should it matter, who's calling plays for Nebraska? On one hand, Scott Frost clearly feels like that's the best thing that he brings to the table. I mean, he's lamented it the entire offseason. He's talked about having to work in a collaboration. He hasn't had a post game yet, or hell, he didn't even have a halftime interview where he hasn't taken a shot at what Mark Whipple has done. And on the other hand, a big part of selling yourself getting to come back for a fifth year when you haven't won enough games and when your team hasn't been successful, and frankly, when your offense hasn't been good at portions of time, was that you're going to go get a veteran play caller to free you up to do other things with this football program. Does it matter? And certainly you paid Mark Whipple enough money to come here to be more than just a quarterback coach. Does it matter ultimately who calls the plays? Or is this just simplistic? Scott Frost's back is against the wall. He's got to do whatever he can to try to keep his job. And if that means reneging on your offensive coordinator 2 games into his tenure, it's not his problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think I got to say, like, it's been like, obviously Scott hasn't won enough, and obviously he's on the hot seat. Like, there's no bones about that. I think largely, like, and this goes for college, it goes for the NFL, all that. Like, largely football these days, like, you have to have more than one. Like, one person's brain typically is not going to, like, win you a lot of games, right? And, like, a lot of the teams that are excelling in the NFL now have really bought into and highlighted the mantra of, like, it's the best idea. It doesn't matter who it comes from. Ultimately, like, if the best idea always wins, and you sort of, like, continue on that path, and you have a lot of voices, and then you just go with the best that comes up. That's the way that you're best off. So, like, in that regard, in that one vein, I don't think it matters, because those are two guys that know a lot about offensive football. And so if they can actually put their heads together, and, Scott has the sort of, like, bandwidth to channel it in the more efficient way, then okay, that's fine. And you know what? If they win 9 games,
Doesn't matter.
Have worked, and what else matters? Like, he made it, and he did what he needed to do to make it, and okay, you made a big call, and it paid off, and on we go. The flip side of that coin, obviously, is just, like, exactly as you said, like, and frankly, like, if they won 9 games and Whipple was like, I'm 64, you took play calling duties away from me after 6 quarters, and then we did this, like, muddy thing about talking about it and all that the rest of the year. I don't need this. I'm retiring. See you later. Like, well, I hope you learned a lot from him in the year he was here, and even maybe that's beneficial. Like, football is sort of a cold world in that regard. I think it's obviously the biggest issue is that it's just not. It wasn't the plan, and plans change. That's fine. But if you're going to do, like, for Scott, like if you're going to do this, it better work. And if it happened, and then if you're going to do it, and if it's going to be permanent, there's a lot of ifs. It had better work, because you sold your boss on being this more CEO type, which never, frankly, like, made a ton of sense to me, because the thing that he's clearly best at is calling plays. Like, that's always been his strength as a football coach, is, like, offense and doing that. And so to take that away, to choose for that to be the thing to give up, and then to have what you're gonna be a bunch of things that's not the thing you're best at, always struck me as being like, well, he has to do this. He doesn't have a choice in the matter. Even though Trev says, I didn't make him this and that. Well, I mean, it was pretty clear what the path was. So in that regard, it's sort of like, if you're going to do this, like, does your boss care about how the plan gets executed, or does your boss only care about the end result? That's the question. And that probably just depends on how many wins the end result includes. So that's a long way of saying, I think you could make an argument either way, that it does matter or it doesn't matter. The way that it doesn't matter is if you win. And that's the big question, is, are they going to win enough for the fact that you changed on the fly, and, there wasn't always a lot of, I don't know what the right term is, bedside manner maybe, and how the offensive talk was after games or at halftime or all that early on. You're like clearly just itching to take it back, and have been from the start, essentially, from the day you gave it up. And I'm not trying to, like, I don't want this to come off as like giving Frost a hard time about all of this. Like, he's an offensive guy. Like, he wants to call the plays, like, and impulse, I mean, it's always been part of the equation with him. When does the impulse kick in, and does it happen in the right times? There's been moments where it's happened at the right time. There's been moments like in the third quarter against Northwestern where it didn't, and so if this is the right time to do this and they have the personnel to go forward and win games doing it his way, it like legitimately might save his career, but it also might not.
Good way to put it. That's why we bring in Parker Gabriel from the USA Today. He might be covering Russell Wilson, but he can also break down Casey Thompson. That's the kind of talent he has. Parker, appreciate you coming on here on a Sunday morning, joining us on Sunday Side Session. A new venture for me, but an opportunity. Awesome. An opportunity to kind of break down the game and get into the big picture stuff, which, believe it or not, with Nebraska, is every single week. You don't get a break. Forever. But that's why we're here. That's why we are here to talk it through, to give people a different opportunity to think about things like this. And as always, people can find more content like this at Husker247. We got plenty of coverage from the game yesterday. We got game balls. We got report cards. We've got Scott Frost breaking down, what happened in that game yesterday. We got players talking. Ernest Hausman spoke for the first time. Nate Borkircher talked. You had Casey Thompson up front. Anthony Grant talked as well. All of that stuff at Husker247 on Sunday. Everybody enjoy your Labor Day weekends. Parker Gabriel, thank you so much for being here. Highly recommend everyone, even the Chiefs fans, help Parker out. Go read some USA Today NFL coverage. The season starts soon there. Parker, wish you the best of luck as you move forward covering the Broncos this year. And we'll stay in touch because I like to pick your brain. You make me smarter. You make everybody else smarter. And with that, happy Labor Day, everyone. And be sure to tune in to Husker 24/7 going forward.